Have you ever looked at your hands and seen the history of a lifetime? The scars from hard work, the spots earned from years under the sun, and the subtle shaking that comes with 90 years of breathing American air? For Arthur Miller, a 90-year-old World War II veteran, those hands had held a rifle in the mud of Europe to protect the very soil he now stood on. But on a cold Tuesday morning in Ohio, those same hands were holding a death sentence, not a physical one, but a financial one. A letter from the city's tax office states he owed $25,000 in back taxes. $25,000. To a man living on a fixed Social Security check, that number didn't just look like debt. It looked like an eviction notice. It looked like the end of his dignity. It looked like the country he bled for had finally forgotten his name. Imagine the tightening in your chest when you realize that the home you've lived in for 50 years, the home where you raised your children and said goodbye to your wife, could be taken away by a computer error or a heartless stumbling glitch. Arthur didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply put on his old, faded military jacket, pinned his medals to his chest, and walked into the mayor's office. He didn't go there to beg for mercy. He went there to ask one simple question: is this what a lifetime of service is worth? Most people in that building ignore him. They saw a frail old man in a dusty uniform. They saw a case number that needed to be cleared, but they didn't know that inside that office, a single missing document was buried under a pile of paperwork. A document that would not only prove Arthur's innocence, but would set off a chain reaction that would bring the entire city's corrupt tax system to its knees. The weight of $25,000 hangs heavy over a man who has already given everything to his country. It is a weight that silences the soul. But Arthur Miller was not a man who stayed silent when justice was at stake. He stood in that cold marble hallway, his medals clinking softly with every breath, waiting for someone to see the human being behind the. What happened when the mayor finally opened that dusty file would change the fate of every veteran in the city. It began with a single piece of paper that everyone thought was lost forever. Arthur Miller walked into the mayor's office not as a victim, but as a man seeking the truth. The air in the hallway feels heavy, sterilized by the scent of floor wax and indifference. To the young clerks behind the glass partitions, he was just another senior citizen struggling with a digital world. They didn't see the foxholes of 1944. They didn't see the Purple Heart tucked away in a velvet box at home. They only saw the red ink on his file, $25,000 of unpaid property taxes that had supposedly been accumulating for a decade. The clerk looked at Arthur's file and then back at his face. She expressed a mask of known coldness. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "the records are clear. Your primary residence exemption was revoked 10 years ago. Without that exemption, your taxes tripled. With interest and penalties, this is the balance. If it isn't paid by the end of the month, the city will move forward with the foreclosure." Arthur leaned against the counter, his fingers gripping the edge of the cold marble. He felt a phantom pain in his leg, an old souvenir from a shrapnel wound that always acted up when he was stressed. "I've lived in that house since 1974, Arthur replied, his voice raspy but firm. "I've never missed a payment. My wife, Martha, handled the books until she passed, and I've handled them since. I sent in my exemption renewal every 2 years, just like the law requires." The clerk didn't even look up. "The system says otherwise. If it's not in the computer, it doesn't exist." This is the moment where the world feels like it's closing in. It's the feeling of being gaslit by a machine. Arthur knew he had mailed those forms. He remembers the smell of the post office, the weight of the envelope, the feeling of relief every time he checked that box off his list. But in this office, his memory is worthless. To them, he was an old man losing his grip on reality. He looked around the room. On the wall was a portrait of the mayor, smiling confidently under the city seal, a man who campaigned on the promise of looking out for our heroes. Arthur felt a surge of quiet indignation. He wasn't asking for a handout. He wasn't asking for charity. He was asking for the justice he had fought to defend. "I want to see the mayor," Arthur said. The room went silent. A few people in the waiting area turned their heads. The clerk finally looked up, a smirk playing on her lips. "The mayor is a very busy man, Mr. Miller. He doesn't handle individual tax disputes. You'll need to file a formal appeal with the board, but the filing fee alone is $500. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered leather wallet. He didn't have $500. He barely had enough for groceries for the rest of the week, but he did have something else. He pulled out a folded yellowed piece of paper. Not the document they were looking for, but his honorable discharge papers. He laid it on the counter. Tell him a sergeant from the 4th Infantry Division is waiting. Tell him I've faced much worse than a tax bill, and I'm not leaving until we settle this. The weight of the past was now sitting on that counter. It was no longer about money. It was about the integrity of a system that was built on the backs of men like Arthur, yet now sought to crush them under its wheels. The clerk stared at the paper, the smirk fading. For the first time that morning, someone in that building saw a human being instead of a debt. But the real battle was only just beginning, buried deep inside a filing cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. The sergeant's discharge papers sat on the mahogany desk, a stark contrast to the modern, polished surroundings of the mayor's inner office. Mayor Robert Sterling, a man political career that was built on a carefully crafted image of strength and patriotism, stared at the document. He looked at the yellowed edges, the official stamp of the United States Army, and the name, Arthur Miller. Then he looked up at the man standing across from him. Arthur didn't sit. He stood straight, his chin tilted just enough to show he wasn't there to beg. The silence in the room was deafening. The mayor's chief of staff whispered in his ear something about procedure and legal precedents, but Sterling waved him off. He had seen the crowd gathering in the lobby. He knew that a 90-year-old veteran being escorted out by security would be a public relations nightmare, but more than that, something in Arthur's eyes troubled him. It was the look of a man who had already seen the worst of humanity and was no longer afraid of it. $25,000, Arthur, the mayor said, his voice dropping to a low, performative rumble. That's a decade of unpaid property taxes. The city auditor's office doesn't make mistakes of this magnitude. They say your senior exemption was canceled because you failed to respond to multiple verification notices sent to your address. I never received a single notice, Arthur replied, his voice steady. But I did send my renewal every 2 years on the first Monday of October. I have the carbon copies of my letters at home, handwritten and dated. But your clerks tell me if it isn't in your computer, I'm a liar. The mayor leaned back, tapping a gold pen against his desk. He was a politician, and he knew how to read people. Arthur Miller wasn't a man who forgot things. He was a man of discipline. Arthur, if I override the auditor's system without proof, I'm opening a door for everyone in this city to claim a glitch. I need more than your word. I need the city's copy of that exemption form. And according to our digital records, it simply does not exist. Then look in the basement, Arthur said. The mayor paused. The basement? Before you went digital in 2014, everything was paper. I've lived in my house since the 70s. My files started in a cabinet, not a cloud. If your computer says it's missing, it's because someone was too lazy to scan it, not because I didn't send it. The chief of staff scoffed. Sir, we have over 500,000 physical files in the annex archives. It would take a team weeks to find one folder from a decade ago. It's not feasible. But Arthur took a step forward. The light caught the silver of his purple heart. I spent 3 days in a freezing trench in the Ardennes, waiting for a supply truck that everyone said wasn't coming. I didn't give up then, and I'm not giving up on my home now. You call yourself a leader? Then lead. Find the paper. The mayor looked at the discharge papers again, then at the clock. The pressure was mounting. He knew that if he sent Arthur away now, the story would hit the local news by evening. But if he found that document, he would be the hero who saved a veteran. He turned to his assistant. Get the head of the records department on the phone. Tell him I want the physical tax annex for the years 2012 to 2015 opened immediately. And I want Arthur Miller's original paper file on my desk before the sun goes down. As the assistant rushed out, the mayor looked at Arthur. You'd better be right about this, Sergeant. Because if that file is empty, there's nothing more I can do. Arthur simply nodded. He knew the truth was there, buried under the weight of a system that had become too big to care. He sat down finally, not because his legs were tired, but because he knew the battle had finally shifted from the marble hallways to the dark, dusty archives where the truth was waiting to be found. The basement of the City Records Annex was a place where time went to die. It was a labyrinth of cold concrete, humming fluorescent lights, and the overwhelming scent of decaying paper and damp dust. For the clerks upstairs, this place didn't exist. They lived in the clean, instantaneous world of glowing screens. But for Arthur, this basement was the last line of defense for his dignity. As the heavy steel door groaned open, a young archivist led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a blade. We haven't processed the 2012 physical intakes in years, sir, the boy asserted, his voice echoing off the stacks of gray filing cabinets. When the city went digital, they only scanned the active files. Anything marked as resolved or archived was just left here to rot. Arthur walked slowly. The sound of his cane tapping against the concrete floor sounded like a ticking clock. He looked at the labels on the drawers, thousands of names, thousands of lives, all reduced to a few sheets of paper in a folder. It made his heart ache. How many other widows, how many other veterans are currently being hunted by the city because their proof was buried in this tomb? Here, the archivist said, stopping at a cabinet in the far corner, tucked behind a leaking pipe. The 2012-2013 exemption renewals, Section M. The drawer screamed as it was pulled open. Arthur watched as the boy's gloved fingers flicked through the folders. Miller, Anthony, Miller, April. The boy stopped. I don't see an Arthur, sir. It jumped straight to Milton. Arthur felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the basement air. Look again, he whispered. Check the misfiled section. Check the bottom of the drawer. The silence that followed was suffocating. The boy pulled the drawer out further, reaching his hand into the dark gap behind the hanging folders. His face contorted as he felt around the dusty metal base. Suddenly, his fingers snagged on something. He pulled back a thin manila folder that had slipped out of its tracks and fell into the shadows of the cabinet floor. It was covered in a thick layer of gray soot. The boy wiped it away with his sleeve, revealing a name scrawled in faded blue ink, Arthur J. Miller, Sergeant, U.S. Army, Ret. Inside was a single piece of paper. It wasn't a computer printout. It was a handwritten form, filled out in the neat, cursive handwriting of Arthur's late wife, Martha. Attached to it was a small, rusted paperclip holding a delivery confirmation receipt from the U.S. Postal Service, dated October 1st, 2012. The document was stamped with a bright red ink that said received, but right next to it, someone had scrawled a note in pencil, pending scan, system down. Because of a broken scanner on a random Tuesday a decade ago, a man who had survived a world war was nearly turned into a homeless statistic. The missing document wasn't missing at all. It had been sitting in the dark, ignored by a system that preferred the cold logic of a computer over the messy reality of a human life. Arthur reached out and touched the paper. He could almost smell Martha's perfume on it. He didn't feel angry yet. He only felt a profound sense of relief that made his knees weak. He wasn't a liar. He wasn't a failure. He was still the man he thought he was. Take it, Arthur said, his voice regaining its command. Take it to the mayor and tell him the sergeant is ready for his apology. The elevator ride back to the top floor felt different. The silence was no longer heavy with doubt. It was charged with the electric energy of impending justice. Arthur Miller stepped back into the mayor's office, the soot-covered manila folder clutched in the archivist's hand like a holy relic. Mayor Sterling looked up from his desk, his eyes immediately locked onto the physical file, the one thing his million-dollar computer system swore didn't exist. The archivist laid the folder on the mayor's mahogany desk. As the dust from the basement settled on the polished wood, the room felt smaller, the air tighter. The mayor reached out. His fingers traced the handwritten name of Arthur Miller. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning Martha's neat cursive, the official delivery receipt, and the fatal pencil note, pending scan, system down. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The chief of staff, who had been so quick to dismiss Arthur, stood frozen in the corner. This wasn't just a clerical error. It was a mirror reflecting the soul of a city that had prioritized efficiency over humanity. 10 years, Arthur said, his voice cutting through the silence like a cold wind. 10 years that document sat in the dark. For 10 years, your system sent me notices I never received, added interest I didn't owe, and threatened to take a roof from a man who spent his youth protecting yours? Tell me, Mr. Mayor, does your computer have a soul? Because if it doesn't, then what are you doing behind that desk? The mayor's face turned a deep shade of crimson. It was a mixture of embarrassment and a rare spark of genuine shame. He looked at the chief of staff, then back at Arthur. Arthur, I don't know what to say. This is an administrative failure of the highest order. The system was supposed to be a tool to help us, not a weapon to be used against our citizens. A tool is only as good as the hand that holds it, Arthur replied, leaning heavily on his cane but refusing to look away. You were so busy looking at screens that you forgot to look at the people. You saw a debt. You saw a problem to be solved. You didn't see a neighbor. You didn't see a veteran who has lived in this city longer than you've been alive. The mayor stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He picked up the file and walked over to the window, looking out at the city he governs. He knew Arthur was right, but he also knew that this wasn't just about one man. If Arthur Miller's file was buried, how many others were currently being crushed by the same invisible gears? Robert, Arthur said, using the mayor's first name for the first time, you campaigned on the promise of a smarter city, but a smart city that forgets its elders is a city that has lost its mind. You have a choice right now. You can fix this for me, or you can fix the system so it never happens to another soul in this town. The mayor turned around, his expression hardening into a look of resolution. He realized that this was his missing document moment, a chance to prove he was more than a portrait on a wall. He picked up his desk phone and hit a speed dial button. Get the city auditor on the line, now, and tell the press secretary to meet me in the briefing room in 15 minutes. We have a debt to settle, and it's much larger than $25,000. The confrontation was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. Arthur Miller had found his paper, but he had also found something much more powerful. He had forced the machine to stop and look him in the eyes. The briefing room was packed with local reporters, their cameras aimed like loaded weapons at the podium. Mayor Sterling stood at the front, but for the first time in his career, he wasn't the center of attention. Standing just to his left, wearing his faded military jacket and holding his cane with ironclad resolve, was Arthur Miller. The mayor cleared his throat, his voice broadcast live across the city. Today, we are not here to talk about budget surpluses or infrastructure, Sterling began, his eyes scanning the crowd. We are here to talk about a failure of the soul. For 10 years, this city has pursued a debt that never existed against a man who spent his youth defending our right to stand in this room. He held up the soot-covered folder from the basement. This is Arthur Miller's missing document. It wasn't lost in a fire. It wasn't stolen. It was buried in a dark corner of our own records annex because our digital transition was more important than our human responsibility. Because of a system error, we tried to steal a veteran's home. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Flashes from the cameras reflected off the medals on Arthur's chest. The mayor continued, his voice growing harder. I have spent the last hour with the city auditor. We discovered that when the scan fail glitch occurred in 2012, it didn't just affect Mr. Miller. It affected 412 other seniors in this district. 412 people who have been living in fear, paying illegal penalties, or losing their homes because we refused to look in the basement. This was the next level twist the audience was waiting for. It wasn't just about Arthur anymore. It was a systemic scandal. The mayor turned to Arthur, and in front of the entire city, he did the unthinkable. He bowed his head. Sergeant Miller, on behalf of the city of Ohio, I am formally dismissing your debt in full, not as an act of mercy, but as an act of long overdue justice. Your property is cleared, your exemption is reinstated, and your dignity is no longer under review. But Arthur wasn't finished. He stepped up to the microphone, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of 90 years of integrity. Mr. Mayor, I appreciate the words, but an apology without action is just a speech. You found my paper, but there are 400 people still in the dark. I didn't fight a war to save my own house. I fought it to save our way of life. I want a promise that every folder in that basement is scanned by the end of the year. I want every penny of illegal interest returned to those widows and veterans. Or you can keep your apology, and I'll keep my fight. The room went dead silent. The reporters held their breath. This was the moment of character versus power. The mayor looked at Arthur, then at the cameras. He knew his political future depends on this second. He reached out and shook Arthur's hand firmly. You have my word, Sergeant. The Miller Protocol begins tomorrow. No senior will ever face a computer-generated debt in this city without a manual, physical review of their history. As the applause broke out, Arthur felt a strange sensation, not of victory, but of duty fulfilled. He had exposed the missing document of the city's conscience. But as the cameras flashed, he caught a glimpse of the city auditor in the back of the room, whispering frantically into a phone. The machine was bleeding, and those who had profited from the silence were beginning to panic. The morning after the press conference, the City Records Annex was no longer a tomb of forgotten papers. It was a hive of activity. Under the mayor's direct orders, 30 temporary staff members had been brought in to begin the massive task of manual auditing. But the real story wasn't in the flickering scanners or the spinning hard drives. It was in the hallway outside Arthur Miller's small, weathered home. Arthur sat on his porch, the peeling white paint of the railing a reminder of how close he had come to losing it all. He wasn't alone. In his small front yard stood a crowd of neighbors, most of them silver-haired, some leaning on walkers, others holding faded tax notices like they were weapons. They weren't there to protest. They were there to witness the impossible. A black city sedan pulled up to the curb. The city auditor, the man who had spent years hiding behind automated accuracy, stepped out. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he held a stack of official envelopes. Under the gaze of the neighborhood, he walked up Arthur's path. "Mr. Miller," the auditor said, his voice barely a whisper, "I have been inspired by the mayor to hand-deliver these, not just to you, but to everyone on this block who was caught in the 2012 glitch." He handed Arthur a check. It wasn't just for the $25,000 of canceled debt. It included a full refund of the convenience fees, the administrative penalties, and the interest the city had illicit collected over a decade. But as Arthur looked at the check, he saw something else. He saw a 92-year-old widow from 3 houses down, Mrs. Gable, receiving her own envelope. She burst into tears, sinking into her plastic porch chair. She had been skipping meals for 2 years to pay a debt that never existed. Arthur stood up. His military jacket caught the afternoon sun. He didn't look at his own check. He looked at the auditor. "Do you see them now?" Arthur asked, gesturing to the tearful faces on the street. "When you sat in your air-conditioned office and clicked send on those foreclosure warnings, did you think about the kitchens these people sat in? Did you think about the sleep they lost? Or were they just digits on a spreadsheet to you?" The auditor looked down at his polished shoes, unable to meet Arthur's eyes. We followed the protocol, sir." "Then your protocol is a crime," Arthur replied. "In the Army, if a commander loses a man because he didn't check his map, he's relieved of duty. You didn't check your map. You ignored the basement because it was dusty, and you let these people suffer in the dark." The ripple effect was moving faster than the city could control. By noon, the local news stations were broadcasting live from Arthur's street. The missing document had become a symbol of a national movement. Across the state, other cities were suddenly discovering their own archived errors. The machine was being forced to recalibrate, not because of a new software update, but because one man had demanded a human answer to a computer's lie. Arthur watched as Mrs. Gable walked over and hugged him, her small frame shaking with relief. He realized then that the $25,000 was never the real prize. The real victory was the silence that had finally been broken, the silence of the forgotten. The basement was empty now, the files were being scanned, but the scars of the last 10 years will remain as a reminder that the price of justice is eternal vigilance. The dust in the basement of the City Records Annex has finally settled, but the echoes of Arthur Miller's footsteps remain. A month has passed since the Miller Protocol was signed into law, and the city of Ohio looks different. It looks more human. The Black City sedans no longer carry foreclosure notices to the doorsteps of the elderly. They carry auditors with clipboards, tasked with double-checking the machine's math against the reality of a neighbor's life. Arthur Miller sits in his favorite armchair, the one Martha bought him 40 years ago. The sunlight through the window catches the cream-colored hand-knitted bookmark tucked into his Bible, the same one Margaret Chen once made for a judge in a different courtroom, a symbol of a shared battle for dignity. He is 90 years old, his hands still shake, and his vision is a bit more clouded than it was yesterday. But as he looks out at his front yard, he doesn't see a debt. He sees a home. "They tell us that aging is a process of losing things," Arthur whispered to the quiet room, as if Martha were still there to hear him. "We lose our strength, we lose our friends, and sometimes we lose our place in the world. But we never, ever lose the right to be seen." The legacy of Arthur Miller isn't just the $25,000 he saved or the 400 seniors who got their homes back. His legacy is the one missing document of our modern age, the realization that technology is a heartless master, but a necessary servant. He proved that a 90-year-old man in a faded jacket has more power than a multi-million-dollar algorithm, provided he has the courage to stand up and say, "I am here." As you watch this, look at your own hands. Look at the people in your life who have lived through the storms you are only just beginning to face. Are we looking at them, or are we looking past them? Are we trusting the red ink on a screen, or are we trusting the character of a lifetime? The system isn't broken by accident, it's broken because we stopped asking one simple question: does this make sense? And if the answer is no, we must be the ones to fix it. Arthur Miller didn't just save his house, he saved the soul of a city. He reminded us that justice isn't found in a computer code. It's found in the courage to look each other in the eye and recognize our shared humanity. Arthur closed his eyes, a small, tired smile on his face. He had fought his last war, and this time, he didn't just survive, he won. And because he won, the next time a system error tries to crush a soul, there will be a protocol, a person, and a memory of a sergeant who refused to be forgotten. Thank you for being a witness to Arthur's story. If you believe that a person's worth is measured by their character and not their credit score, then remember his name. Remember that your voice, no matter how quiet or shaky, is the only thing that can truly silence the machine. Good night, Arthur, and welcome home.